He had unparalleled access to the tight inner circle of advisors who have surrounded Joe Biden for years. In today's Midday Fix, we're talking to journalist Frank Foer, author of the new book, The Last Politician, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. He joins us now from Washington. Frank, thanks for joining me. Congratulations on the book. I've read it from cover to cover. And let me start by asking you this. You know, Biden said he was going to be a transitional president to move us from Trump back to a baseline for a new generation. But you write that actually he didn't want to be a placeholder. He had a grand agenda. Don't those two things conflict?
Well, I don't think he ever really wanted to be a transitional president in being a placeholder president. He wanted to be somebody who put his mark on history, who joined the pantheon of great Democratic presidents, which is why he's proposed legislation that's so much more ambitious than anybody expected.
His relationship with Kamala Harris, a lot of people are talking about that. You write extensively about it. Obviously, Obama picked Biden because Biden filled a gap for Obama in his background, the international and the seasoned politician situation. That wasn't the case for Biden. He didn't need somebody to fill those gaps. So Kamala Harris comes in a very different situation. And I think it's arguable from reading the book that he almost sets her up for failure, giving her the border project, other things which are almost impossible to handle, it seems.
I don't know if he set her up for failure, but he made it so that it was very hard for her to establish her own distinct political identity because it wasn't clear where she fit in Joe Biden's universe. He didn't need her to fill a gap like foreign policy or to commune with the Senate Republicans. And so she's been left, I think, really foundering to find her way.
Regarding others who surround a president, you write that Obama used to surround himself with lots of experts so he could sort of judge from that. Biden tends not to do that. He's got a tight circle of advisors, but the decisions are his own.
Right. He's got a group of people who've worked with him largely since the 1980s. They know how Joe Biden works, and he can be very quirky about the information that he requires and the process that he goes about in order to make a decision. But there's this impression that he's somehow this marionette and that there's some sort of puppet master sitting in the background, and the opposite is true. He's a very hard-charging, very demanding boss who really rejects his aide's opinion in very critical moments in the course of his presidency. The decisions are indeed his own.
This book covers his first 2 years. It sort of ends with the midterm elections. But one of the issues that tormented him personally, and yet you write, saved him politically, was the Dobbs case, the issue of abortion. It's such a powerful statement you have in the book, but talk about that.
Well, Joe Biden is a devoted Catholic, and I think he's really struggled with his place within the Catholic Church as somebody who is a liberal Democrat or has been a liberal Democrat through his career. And he's talked a lot about that with Nancy Pelosi and John Kerry, other liberal Catholics. And when it came time for the Dobbs decision and the administration's response, he was really flat-footed. He didn't want to be criticized by his own church, and he was tormented. It really took this case of a 10-year-old girl from Ohio and her doctor in Indianapolis who gave her an abortion, who was prosecuted then. And that was really the thing that galvanized Joe Biden when he was able to grasp the radicalism of the Dobbs decision. This wasn't a reprise of the abortion politics of the 1980s and 1990s. This was something far more sweeping.
Our departure from Afghanistan has been written about a lot. It was anything but smooth. But you write about something really interesting, and that is Hillary Clinton's anger that she basically created a list of 125 people, politicians, civil society leaders, media, women who needed to be helped. And basically that fell on the deaf ear of a White House. That was stunning.
Well, in fact, the list that you're describing was a list that was leaked to her by a government official who had compiled the list, which was of 125 women who would be vulnerable if the Taliban came to power. And I told her story as kind of a counterpoint to the Biden story because she could see the disaster that was coming. She kept putting pressure on the administration to do more. And when the Ghani government collapsed, she organized her own network of safe houses and security in order to extricate 1,000 women and then arranged for them to be resettled into Albania. It's a very harrowing story.
Most people would say Biden is, at least whether you like him or not, is one of the most empathic presidents that we've ever had. And he's always told us, he'll always tell us the truth. He'll level with the American people. But as I look at the title of your book, which is The Last Politician, maybe he is just another of that generation who maybe always doesn't level with the American people.
Well, I know that he, in the case of Afghanistan, he didn't do a very good job of forecasting what was about to come. But I think that he tends to inflate his own role in certain stories when he narrates things from his past. But you take something like COVID. I think that he really tried hard to be honest with the American people about when the return to normal would happen. And so I'm not sure that he's struggled that much with leveling with the people.
All right, fair enough. By the way, we have to have a moment left, but you close the book with this great sentence: Biden was a man for his age. So many ways to take it. What do you mean?
Yeah, so I was doing that kind of as a play on words, and I was talking about that specifically in the context of Ukraine, which was, I think, the moment in his presidency that highlighted most the wisdom that comes with being somebody who's been around the block a lot of times. And he served as kind of a father figure for the Western alliance, and he helped keep Ukraine on track while avoiding anything that would dangerously escalate the situation and contribute to a war.
Well, a very complex book of a complex 2 years. The book is called The Last Politician: Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. It is available now. You can also follow Frank on social media. Frank, thank you for your time. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.